Hello, and welcome to another episode of Dragon Dreams. My name is Ivan, and I'm going to be talking today about religion in role-playing games. And this is of particular interest to me because I got my bachelor's degree in college in Greco-Roman classics. And I was very interested in the religions of the ancient world, of ancient Greece, and of the ancient Roman Empire. And in some ways, this knowledge is actually of more use, I think, to people who want to do fantasy religions than the modern monotheistic religions of today are, because those monotheistic religions are actually very different. And I'm not going to talk directly about Greco-Roman religion because I might do another video on that, but that's a whole other subject. But I think that kind of by design, with a lot of sword and sorcery and stuff, I think a lot of sword and sorcery authors were thinking back to the Greco-Roman period. Whether or not they had Greco-Roman technology, they might have had medieval technology or even Renaissance technology, but I think they were thinking back in those terms. Which is why our fantasy worlds often have so many different gods. You know, they're basically polytheistic. So why talk about religion in RPGs at all? I mean, many people may say, well, unless I'm playing a cleric or a druid or a paladin, maybe a barbarian if I rely on some god to give me my berserk rage or something like that. Why does religion matter? And I think a lot of players, in fact, do play it that way. That, you know, I've noticed that players don't seem to care about religion at all, unless they're a cleric, a druid, or a paladin, or some other character class that is explicitly a religious class. And then they only care about the powers they get from it. And so there's very little engagement with the world. There's all these gods, and somebody's got to worship them, not just the priests of those gods. But, you know, nobody ever seems to. And I think that's a real shame. I think there's an untapped resource where religion can become a very big, important part of a fantasy role-playing game. And I can only speculate that maybe in today's secular culture, we get a little scared to talk religion or politics because, you know, those are hot button issues, and we're often taught that it's not polite unless, you know, we're there to talk about religion or politics. And then we should be respectful and so forth, which we should. But that's the real world. We want to play in a fantasy world that has its own stuff, you know, that has dragons and magic and gods, you know, and if you're going to, where there's gods, there's religion. And actually, it makes more sense to me that there's religion in a world where you know that there's gods than in one in which we don't. So I think that this is a really neat topic for that reason. And my thinking with this started when I read the 1979 adventure module by Gary Gygax, one of the founders of Dungeons & Dragons, called Village of Hamlet. And Village of Hamlet has in it this political kind of wrangling that's going on within the village. It's not nobody's killing each other over it, but it's just a point of tension in the village between two religions. And those religions are the old faith of the Druids and this new church that Voluna, which is a theocracy, the overarching, it's not a kingdom, it's actually a theocracy, but the overarching country has installed this new church of St. Cuthbert, mainly in response to the fact that there's this place called the Temple of Elemental Evil not far off, where an ancient demon queen was imprisoned about 20 years ago. And there's sort of this thinking that they need to, kind of advance the religion of good gods into that region. Whereas the Druids are neutral. They believe in the balance of nature. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. Here back in 1979, Gary Gygax, one of the founders of D&D, had a very distinct concept of religion in society, not just religion played by player characters, not religion that gives you cleric spells and druid spells or paladin lay on hands, but religion that's actually what people hold dear and sacred, that ordinary people, ordinary peasants are involved with. And in fact, in my current AD&D First Edition campaign that I'm playing, in the world of Greyhawk, the same world that Village of Hamlet is set in, I decided I liked Village of Hamlet so much that I'm going to come from there. So my magic user, Cedric, is a member of the old faith of the Druids, just because I thought that was interesting. And that was actually the older religion. That's like the established religion in Hamlet. And the newfangled one is this good religion of St. Cuthbert. So Cedric believes in a balance of natural forces. He's a magic user. He doesn't get druid spells for doing that. He doesn't get anything, as far as I know, from doing that. But he believes in it. And it was the religion that he grew up in. So, I thought, how come there aren't more player characters who are religious when basically everybody else is? And so I thought, maybe if we talk about religion, people will get excited about it and want to have religious dimensions to their characters. So I'm going to dive right in after a drink of water. So let me kind of go over the landscape of religion in our world so that we have a better idea of what sorts of things we might imagine in our fantasy worlds. You have different categories of religion with regard to beliefs about spirits and gods. You have monotheism, which is popular in the West today, as well as in the Middle East, which is the notion that there's only one God, and that God is the only deity. There's no others. The God may be three persons in one, or something like that, but is the only deity. And all the other deities are false deities. Then there is monism, M-O-N-I-S-M. And I believe, the Hindus will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's what Hinduism is. So in Hinduism, there's a concept that all gods are one God. All gods are God. And there is sort of this hierarchy of emanation from Deva, which is God, which means God, and Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, Shiva, the destroyer, who are all good gods, by the way, to many different incarnations of these deities. And so that's monism. Then you have henotheism, Henotheism, which is the belief that there are many gods, but only one of them is worth worshipping. And as I understand, this is how both Zoroastrianism and Judaism actually began. Zoroastrianism originated in Persia, and when they had many gods, they were polytheistic, but the Zoroastrians said that Ahura Mazda was the only good god, and all the rest were not so good. And as I understand, what archaeologists and historians are now beginning to discover about the history of the ancient Hebrews is that there may have been a henotheistic idea before there was a monotheistic idea, which makes sense of passages in the Bible like, you shall have no other God before me. Right? In other words, they're saying that their God, Jehovah, Yahweh, is the only God that the Hebrew people will worship. But there's other gods. There's just, if you're a good Hebrew, you don't worship them. I hope I haven't offended anybody with that. I realize that modern Judaism is monotheistic. At least I believe it is. It's just that's a note that historians have made that, it used to be kind of a slightly different thing. Then you also have Duotheism, and actually Zoroastrianism fits in with this as well, because Duotheism is the concept that there is one good god and one evil god, who are the sources of good and evil in the universe. And in Zoroastrianism, I believe, as I said, there's Ahura Mazda, the good god. There's also, I think it's Ahriman. Zoroastrians will correct me again in the comments if I'm wrong. But anyway, there's an evil god. And then you have polytheism. Polytheism is just the concept that there's many gods. There's not necessarily a hierarchy in which, all are one. It's simply just, there might be some philosophers or mystics or whatever might see it that way, but most of the general populace just look at it as there's many gods. So the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the Old Norse, the ancient Celts, a lot of these ancient cultures were that. And that, incidentally, is absolutely, bar none, the most common fantasy religion, that, as near as I can tell. In other words, most fantasy worlds seem to have many deities. It's pretty rare to have anything else. Which is one reason why I'm going through all this, because it might spark some ideas. Then there's Animism. Animism is the idea that there is spirit in everything, and that there's many spirits. So there's the spirits of the trees, and the rocks, and the rivers, and the land, and the sky, and just everything. And, you worship local spirits. There's also Ancestor Religions, in which you basically worship your ancestors. And possibly also ancestral heroes. Now, when I say heroes, I don't necessarily mean heroes like Hercules. Although in fact it turns out that in ancient Greece, Hercules was a sort of ancestor, part of a sort of ancestor religiosity that was part of Greek religion. Greek religion is more complicated than just polytheism. But oftentimes what's more common is you have like the aristocracy, kings and queens, lords and ladies, believed that they could trace their lineage back to some sort of ancient king or hero or queen or some sort of person, usually with supernatural powers, who lived long ago, according to myth. And so it's sort of like their ancestor worship is kind of above and beyond other people's ancestor worship. I mean, imagine if, say, like in the UK, instead of being an Anglican country, they were an ancestor worship country. If you think about it, the House of Windsor would have like really awesome ancestors, maybe notorious ancestors, but pretty awesome ancestors. So you could imagine how you look at the royal family's ancestry and you're gonna like, whoa, they're really powerful. They have powerful ancestors. Then you also have philosophical, mystical religions. Excuse me. So an example of that would be Buddhism. So Buddhism is based on philosophy and also on mysticism. Different forms of Buddhism have various different types of spiritual beings in them. Celestial Buddhas, various different bodhisattvas, sometimes deities, ancestor spirits. A lot of these turn out to actually come from the native religions that were present before Buddhism came into an area. So if the area had gods, they would say something like, well, the Buddha taught the gods to meditate and became enlightened, and so the gods are worth worshipping. But the early Buddhists in India, Buddhism started in India 2,500 years ago, and the early Buddhists there believed that the gods aren't really worth worshipping. They're sort of like henotheists -1. In other words, they didn't think any god is worth worshipping. And they focused on human wisdom. So you could have something like that with monasteries and wise people, sages. You also have nature religions, which are religions that it's a little bit of a different way to slice the cake, because they often have gods or spirits in them, but there's a focus on nature. And the animism is kind of nature, typically a nature religion. But like Taoism would be an example of a nature religion, because Taoism has to do with kind of the flow of this mysterious thing called the Way, or the Tao, which is in all of nature, and they look very carefully at how nature works, and it's about aligning yourselves with nature and kind of being in harmony with nature. And of course, you can have hybrids of all of these. So as I alluded to earlier, like the ancient Greeks were primarily polytheistic, but they also had ancestor worship in there. They had spirits. In fact, some people have said that the only difference between polytheism and animism is that polytheists have great deities and minor deities, and animists have great spirits and minor spirits, which seems to sort of amount to the same thing. So, take your pick of whether or not you think those are valid distinction. But it's a distinction that scholars make. Sources of religion. In a lot of traditional religions, native religions and so forth, the main source is mythology. Although that gets a little bit tricky, because here is something that's going to kind of blow a lot of your minds, which is there's mythology, but there's also ritual ceremonies, religious practices. And actually, it turns out that in a lot of cases, the rituals came first, and then the myths followed. But the myths followed to explain the rituals, and then later generations decided that the myths came first and the rituals are in commemoration of the myths. So, an example of that is in the Elosinian mysteries of ancient Greece that center around the agricultural deities. You have this sacred Boulder, and they say that, and this is one thing if you're an initiate into these mysteries, that you'd go past and probably something happened. We don't know the details, but something probably happened at this boulder. And the myth says that this is the boulder that Demeter sat on and wept after her daughter Persephone was taken down into the underworld. Now, which came first, the chicken and the egg, the boulder or the goddess, right? Maybe the boulder was always a sacred boulder, and they did stuff at the boulder, and then later on, they decided that this is the myth that explains why they do stuff at the boulder. So that can happen. So the sources of myth-based religions are also kind of ritual-based religions or practice-based religions that have, sort of this chicken and egg kind of thing where, practices beget myths, myths beget practices, and so forth. And then another approach is you have holy book-based religions, which we're familiar with now. And with holy book-based religions, though it sort of seemed to give you a gold standard that myths don't give you, because there's a zillion different versions of the myth, unfortunately, the truth is that there's lots of different versions of most holy books. So, an example of that is, if you look at, like, the Catholic Bible versus the Protestant Bible, there's disagreement about, which books are authentic. There's books that are in the Catholic Bible that are not in the Protestant Bible, and books that are in the Protestant Bible that are not in the Catholic Bible. Like I believe, I'm not sure, Catholics will correct me on this, but I believe the Book of Revelation is not in the Catholic Bible. So I think that one interesting thing about holy books is that if you had a holy book-based religion, you might think in terms of what different versions are there, what different interpretations are there, how holy wars happen because of this. So those are some of the different ways that religions can kind of get fed or derive their meaning, or belief systems. Another important point is that it turns out scholars now understand that the vast majority of the world's religions are practice-based, not belief-based. The two main exceptions to this are Christianity and Islam, which of course are the world's two most popular religions. So take your pick how to look at religion, whether you think that the religions that have the most members matter the most, or the number of religions that are this way or that way matter the most in terms of the bell curve of what religion is. Well, when I say practice-based, I mean belief-based, most people in the West know that. It's because what you're familiar with. It's like the Christian creed. You have to believe that, Jesus Christ was God made manifest in flesh, the Son of God, all that kind of stuff. If you don't believe certain things, you're not a Christian, is my understanding of Christian creed. And again, I'm not saying that to offend anybody. I'm really saying that my understanding is that in Christianity, there's this thing called the creed, and if you agree with it, then you're a Christian. If you don't agree with it, you're not. And it's the same thing with Islam. There's, what is it? God is, there's one God and Muhammad is his final prophet, right? That's the thing that Muslims believe. If you believe that, then you're a Muslim. If you don't believe that, you're not. Whereas practice-based religions are not defined in terms of belief. People certainly believe things, but what exactly they believe varies substantially. So ancient Greek religiosity was certainly a practice-based religion. Their practices were very orthodox. I mean, they were very much like, in this particular city-state, this is how we do things, and that is the tradition, that is the custom. You look at the philosophers, and the philosophers would argue over all sorts of matters about belief. Okay, so for example, the philosopher Epicurus believed that there were gods that cause the planets to move and the celestial body of the heavens to move, because he didn't see any logical reason not to believe that. I mean, it seems reasonable. I mean, they didn't have modern astronomy. They didn't know things we know now about how these things work. It seemed plausible that there are gods that move the planets, but he did not believe in astrology, because astrology would say things like, well, if Mercury is in retrograde, then it's a bad time to travel, it's a bad time to communicate, send messages and things like that. Because Mercury is the god of, actually it's Hermes in Greece, but whatever, Mercury Hermes, the god of messengers and travelers, and he's the one who controls the planet Mercury. And so if Mercury is in retrograde, then it means that doesn't work. It's sort of backwards. And Epicurus said, that's ridiculous. I don't believe that. I don't believe, in other words, that the position of the planets affect our fate. I believe that they are controlled by God. I just don't believe that they affect our fate. So the philosophers had all sorts of different ideas about what to believe, what to do, how to think through all this. The philosopher Epictetus said that the main reason why you should go to religious festivals is because your family and friends do. So, there's all sorts of different beliefs. I once encountered a Hindu woman that I talked to, and she told me that she was an atheist. And I said, well, with all due respect, I'm just curious, how is it possible to be a Hindu and an atheist? I mean, you worship gods, right? And she said, yes, I do worship gods. Worshipping a loving God makes me more loving. Worshipping a compassionate God makes me more compassionate. But I don't believe that the gods really exist. And why does that make sense to her? Because Hinduism, as I understand, is a practice-based religion. There's all sorts of things you can do in Hinduism. There's mantras and yantras and pujas and all sorts of things. So that's the variety of religion in the world. I'll also make one other note while I'm on the subject of varieties of religion in the real world, which is that religions differ very greatly over how they feel about magic. That's something you all might want to consider in a fantasy world where magic exists. Some examples. The classical Greeks at a particular time, not later on, but at a particular time, believed that magic, by which they meant any old person doing miracle working, which might be because you make offerings to the gods, was bad and unlawful, and often had laws against it, as I understand. I might be wrong about that. It's been 25 years. Whereas the priests of various deities at the temples, if they caused miracles to happen because offerings were made to the gods, and that was sanctioned by the state, and that was fine. On the other hand, the Egyptians thought magic is great, magic is wonderful. They absolutely believed in magic. They had court magicians they had temple magicians. They had magicians who were priests in Egyptian temples who were explicitly magicians. And they would sometimes be called on by the pharaoh to do things like curse enemy invaders, which I think is just cool. And they had some of the most horrific curse stuff. Like, you think what are those things called? Voodoo dolls. You think voodoo dolls are creepy. They have these stuff like voodoo dolls, but instead of sticking pins in them, they do stuff like hang them upside down and dip them in boiling oil. And they make them, look like the king they wanted to curse. It was the enemy, invading enemy. And and they had no problem with that. They also had no problem with things like putting chains on the statues of their gods to hold the god into the statue and keep the god from leaving. They didn't think that was wrong. They didn't think that was immoral. The Greeks thought that was they were just staggered by this. They were like, you can't do that. You can't, try to control the gods. The Egyptians sort of went, what? It's practical, we want the gods to stay in Egypt and help us, So people have a very wide variety of beliefs. And then I want to talk about how good, evil, order, chaos, and nature come into play in the world's religions, because those bear on the alignment system. So some religions have good and evil gods. The Zoroastrians, as I said, believed in a good god and an evil god, or a good god and multiple evil gods in different periods, as I understand. The Hindus believe in good gods called devas and evil gods called asuras, although a Hindu friend of mine clarified to me recently that the asuras are not exactly evil as much as ignorant, whereas the devas are enlightened. But I think it amounts to the same thing, essentially, because, the asuras are not nice at all, I don't think. They're perfectly happy to do things like create plagues and stuff like that. So, more or less what we think of as being evil gods for D&D or role-playing game purposes, I think. And then other religions in other religions, the gods are good, or God is good, but there are devils and demons that are evil. So the Neoplatonists, who were Greek philosophers of the late Roman imperial period, just around the time of Christianization, when Constantine converted to Christianity, sort of in that era, there were still plenty of people who were not Christian, who worshipped the old gods, and the Neoplatonists were among them. And the Neoplatonists concluded that that all of the gods are good, and evil is an absence of good, and they thought that there were these beings called kakadaimones, evil spirits, that are evil and twisted. Now, I should mention, in case you're saying, well, wait a second, I've read Greek mythology, the gods do all sorts of immoral things. Yes, they knew that, and they had an answer to that, which is the myths are not to be taken literally. In fact, they said that the myths are actually, may have been deliberately meant to, mess with the heads of fools, to use modern parlance, so that only the wise can interpret them. So you have to see past the immorality that the gods seem to have in the myths and understand them metaphorically and understand that they mean something else. And then, of course, most of us are aware of Christianity and Islam that have notions of a good God and then an evil devil and evil demons. So that's how good and evil works there. And then, with regard to order and chaos, in the ancient Mesopotamians had gods of chaos, which are kind of monster gods. Tiamat, not the Dungeons and Dragons Tiamat, the original Babylonian goddess Tiamat. Apsu, and their monster offspring. The gods were also their offspring, but the gods of civilization rebelled against them and killed them, and created, civilization, according to their myths. And some religions are just nature-oriented. So, I already mentioned Taoism. My understanding is that the Japanese religion Shinto holds that the kami, K-A-M-I, which are usually translated gods or spirits, are just beings of nature. They're natural. And not necessarily good as much as they are just part of nature. And they have the same range of human emotions that we do. And so the goal is to be on good terms with them and to live in harmony with nature. But I think there is a concept that, and Shintoists will correct me if I'm wrong, that you're supposed to live in harmony with nature if you're practicing Shinto. And so, sort of, there's harmony and disharmony. And being in disharmony is kind of the realm of demons and twistedness and ignorance and so forth. So, how can we apply all of these to RPGs? First, I want to talk about non-mechanical ways. In other words, ways that don't involve rolling dice. One is that your PC can simply have religion. What god or gods do they worship if your world's polytheistic? Or what, in Mystara, they have something more like ancestor worship with the immortals who were originally alive, but were kind of heroes who lived long ago and died and now grant, cleric spells from beyond, and those are worshipped in the religion. So, what religion, if you're in Mystara, which immortals do your characters worship? And and why? What are their values? What do they hold dear? Do they worship them because they worship the gods of agriculture because they're farmers, or the sea gods because they're fishermen? Do they worship good gods because they believe in being good. They worship, the god of thieves and liars who protects you from thieves and liars because they're sort of a shady sneak thief who wouldn't go out of their way to hurt people if they didn't have to, but is basically just trying to survive in a crazy hostile world. I think those are interesting questions, and we very frequently give our characters hobbies, personality traits, backgrounds. So why not religion in there as well? I mean, that's another thing that just adds color to your character, makes them interesting. Maybe a little bit of healthy inter-party strife. My character Cedric doesn't like Saint Cuthbert because there's this politics in his village. Fortunately, none of the players in my party, characters in my party, worship Saint Cuthbert, but he just doesn't like Saint Cuthbert. Saint Cuthbert's a good god. If push came to shove, he'd probably, make nice with a cleric of Saint Cuthbert or worshiper of Saint Cuthbert. It's just because of the politics of the village that he comes from that he just doesn't like the Church of St. Cuthbert because they're the newfangled religion and he thinks the old ways are perfectly good, thank you very much. And it just adds color to his character. It also says something about his values. It explains why he's true neutral, which he is. So it could explain why you have the alignment that you have. I think oftentimes people pick their gods based on their alignment, but why not do it the other way around? Why not pick your alignment based on the god or gods you worship, right? In other words, what values do you have? Religion can also impact characters in more social or even political ways. There's this setting that I'm really starting to like called Dolmenwood, which comes out of the OSR. It's made by the same people who did Old School Essentials. And it's compatible with Multicook BX and really pretty much anything. Anyway, there they have this fairy forest that is like, Dolmenwood, which is just this deep forested area. And the humans and some of the not humans who live in what passes for civilization in this very kind of savage place, which isn't really very civilized, have a religion called the Religion of the One True God. Now, as Ben Milton on Question Beast said, this is not Christianity, folks, in case you were wondering. It explicitly says, whatever larger setting you place Dolmenwood in, take one of the gods from there and make that the one true god. In other words, these people are henotheists. They believe that there's only one good god in the world and the rest of them are kind of corrupt or evil or whatever. They don't deny the existence of other gods. They're actively afraid of the so-called pagans who live deep in the forest. Who probably are just people who worship other gods, like most people do in fantasy worlds. And most of their religion has to do with their fear of fairy and the fairies who inhabit Dolmenwood and don't always have a friendly relationship with humans. And they see themselves as defending civilization from the fairies. So this is kind of how their religion takes place, and I'm running a BX D&D campaign in Dolmenwood right now, but I set Dolmenwood on the savage coast of the world of Greyhawk, and we have a cleric of Pelor in the party. Pelor is the sun god of Greyhawk, and I decided that Pelor is the one true god according to this church. And so this cleric was very surprised that here she's totally fine with different deities, just this is the one she happens to worship, to find out that her god is thought by these other priests of Pelor as being the one true god, So that's made things very interesting, and I hope my players are having fun with that. It's also meant that the party elf has so far been ostracized. Now it may be the other way sometimes. We'll see. Religion can shape our values as well, and so you start thinking about values, ethics, morals. What's your character's outlook on the world? And I love to throw in festivals. Religions have festivals. And remember when I said that religions are often practice-based? It's sort of an obstacle for us, if I may say so, in the Western world, where Protestant Christianity, at least here in America, is so dominant. And the forms of Protestant Christianity that we have are very, if anything, less practice-based even than Roman Catholicism, because they rejected a lot of the just really neat stuff they have in Roman Catholicism with, saint days and stuff like that, as just being something that they didn't want to have anything to do with. And so a lot of Protestant Christian religion seems to revolve around, you go to church, the choir sings, you hear the sermon, and there's charity work and stuff, but there isn't a whole lot of practices. So I'd encourage you, if you want your campaign setting to really pop, fill it with festivals, weird stuff. Look at medieval Catholic saint days, or modern Catholic saint days for that matter. Look at Carnival, which turns out to be Catholic. Look at olden day European or British festivals for inspiration. Look at May Day. Look at Lammas. Look at some of the older customs of Halloween. Look at midsummer bonfires, mummers plays. I put a link in the description of an 80s rock video, Men with Hats Safety Dance. It's just a really fun video, and it's just, like a rural medieval village having a festival. So that's your inspiration there. You can look anywhere for these inspirations. Like in Dolmenwood right now, my party is in this this town where they're celebrating the festival of one of the saints. Can't remember which saint it is. And it's a festival that involves burning unicorn effigies and eating partridge pastries. That's all you need. Like a couple of little lines. What festivals do they have to honor the sea gods when winter's over and it's time for the sea trade to begin again? What festivals do they have to honor the changing of the seasons? Do they have planting festivals, harvest festivals? They might have baby blessings, coming of age rituals, weddings, funerals, knightings, installations of nobles, oaths of fealty. Those might all be religious. In fact, they were. If you look at knighting ceremonies, when I was looking into knighting ceremonies in actual medieval Europe, of course, in Western Europe, they were Roman Catholic, because everybody in Western Europe prior to the Protestant Reformation was Roman Catholic. They had to be. There's no other choice. That's what everybody was. So you look at, knighting ceremonies, and there's a ton of religious stuff in them. You could have religious stuff in your knighting ceremonies, too. And another thing that I know from my knowledge of Greco-Roman religion is that it's very common in a lot of ancient religions, particularly the sorts of ones that we want to model fantasy religions on. Very, very common to have offerings more than prayers. I mean, yeah, you pray, but you don't just pray. That turns out to have been a very Christian thing. That comes in with the Gospels when Jesus says, if you look at the Old Testament in the Bible, it turns out the ancient Hebrews had offerings. They offered like frankincense, for example, in the Temple of Jerusalem. And Jesus said, you don't have to do that. You only have to say the Lord's Prayer. That was radical for that time. And it turns out that most people, including the ancient Hebrews actually, as I said, worshipped through offering primarily more than prayer. You pray after you offer. Well, if you offer to have a good relationship with your deity or deities. Once you establish that relationship, then you could pray for something. So consider, do you offer little cakes? And that's common. Do you offer incense or herbs in the fire? Do you offer candlelight? Do you light candles? Do you offer wine or cream or oil, like olive oil or honey? Those are all, common offerings in ancient times, in ancient Europe and the Mediterranean. So I think that makes things very interesting, because it means you have to have little, you have to carry incense with you. If you're religious, particularly if you're a cleric, you've got to have the paraphernalia on you. You can't just pray. You can't just hold up your holy symbol and say, now let us pray. You have to, do the offering. And if the offering has to go in the fire, then you have to build a fire. If it has to go in the earth, you have to dig a pit, throw it in the earth. Those are common ways to offer. You could offer also maybe into the wind or other things, into the water, into bodies of water, into the ocean or the rivers. So that's something to consider as well. And finally, I want to get to mechanical ways that you could bring religion into this, and then I'm going to have some concluding remarks. If your character is not like a cleric or paladin or druid or whatever, here are some thoughts I have about how you might bring game mechanics in, because if the gods are real, why not? One is, if you are pious to your deity, or deities, then you get one reroll per session, provided that it has something to do with your deity. So, for example, if you worship the gods of the sea, you're on a sea voyage, there's a storm, the water's about to wash you off overboard. Okay, I'm back. I have no idea why QuickTime does this. Sometimes QuickTime just stops in the middle of things for no apparent reason. But as I was saying, you could make, let's say it's a pitching ship, it's a storm, and your character is about to be washed overboard, and the GM calls for a dex check, and you fail it, and the GM says, okay, you're going to be washed overboard. And you say, okay, wait a second. I worship the sea gods. I pray to, and I'm a cleric, you're just an ordinary person, but I pray to the sea gods to save me. Maybe you get to make that dex check over again, and if you make it this time, then, by divine miracle, somehow the ship tilted right at the last minute and you stayed on board, or whatever. The wave came up and pushed you back in, and it was the sea gods. I think that would be really cool, because it would encourage people to have a religion. It would encourage people to be pious and to do what they thought their gods wanted them to do. And it would give them, some edge, but not too much of an edge. It wouldn't, bleed over into being a cleric or a druid. It would just be a neat little thing they could do once a session. Number 2. If you die, have a small chance that if your character has been very pious, very good, that their god might come to them as they're crossing over and make a deal and say, listen, I'll allow you to live, but you must spend the rest of your life on a particular mission, solving world hunger or something like that. And they can turn it down, in which case they die and go to their god's outer plane. They've earned it. But if they accept it, they must go on this mission. They must dedicate the rest of their lives to whatever it is that God has said. And if they don't, for however much time, I don't know, what, a week, a month, or whatever, if they slack off from that, then the God will withdraw their power to stop them from dying, and they'll die. Like instantly, just instantly fall over dead. And I think that's an interesting one, because I know there's a big debate right now in our community about PC death. Some people are very adamant that, if you die, you die. If we'll say you die, you die. And no big deal. Make a new character, bring my new character in. And a lot of people feel strongly that that's, kind of how the game works, and it's just no fun if you can't die. Other people say, well, I don't want my character to die. I love my character. I've been playing my character for, years, and I really care about my character and build up their personality so much, and it's just, they're just so important to me and everything. And I want them to die. And I was sort of thinking this might, be an interesting thing to throw in the mix there. Again, it would give you another reason to do it. I don't know what the chance would be, 1 in 6, 1 in 10, I don't know, 5% per level. I don't know what, maybe it would happen all the time. I don't know. It's an interesting thought. And I don't know how many times they could get this deal. Maybe they only get one deal, I'm still mulling it over. I haven't actually experimented with it. That's food for thought. I've often thought it would be neat to have kind of like superstitions or lucky practices that anybody could do that would not give you any more than like a +1 or +5% on something. Maybe would ward off particular types of monsters like vampires or werewolves. But it seems like something like, if you go to the planting festival or the harvest festival, then it ought to increase your yield by a certain amount. Something like that. Little things like that anybody could do, but you have to work at it. Maybe not things that are so useful in a dungeon crawl, or maybe they are useful in a dungeon crawl. Maybe you have a little wicker talisman that gives you a +1 to hit or something. Never more than that. Just a little thing. I don't know. Or maybe you only get it for a certain amount of time. Maybe if you do honor this particular deity in a particular way on this particular hill by the full moon, then, for the next month you get a +1 to hit or something. I don't know. And I actually started giving my clerics little blessings they could do that have to do with their deity. So if they worship a deity of the fields, they could bless a farmer's field, and the farmer might get like a +10% yield on that. Or there was one player I had who was a priest of justice who used this to great effect. His power, in addition to cleric spells, was once per day he could kind of tilt the law courts just a little bit in favor of justice. And there were these outcasts from this one town who wanted to come back in, and the town elder didn't want to let them in. And this cleric sat down and used his power to bring justice to bear, but it only works to actually bring real justice in. And so it only happens if it's just. And I allowed that. I thought that was a great bit of role-playing, and it just made the role-playing more interesting. It's not powers that are going to be used in a dungeon crawl. And then a final thought that I have is a lot of people seem to treat the diversity of gods in a fantasy world as if everybody only worships one god. And I think it's because in today's world in the West, we have, and in the Middle East as well, it's very common to have monotheistic religions. So we're used to the idea that, Christians have, Jesus Christ, and Muslims have, Allah, and, so forth. And I think when people relate to religion in a fantasy world, they often relate in that way. But that's not actually how it was in most polytheistic cultures. Like in ancient Greece and Rome, people worshipped as many gods as they could. I mean, you needed to survive. Needed to, according to their belief systems, and so there's absolutely no reason why anybody might not worship, all the good gods, or if all the gods are good, all the gods, or lots of different deities. They might worship, and even if you're a cleric, you could worship different deities. You're devoted to one deity. So if you think about what how you'd relate to them, the deities are not mutually exclusive. They are not. You have to pick one. They're not rival. The temples are not usually rivals. Now, if they're rival alignments, sure. But, usually the temples in the ancient world got along just fine for the simple reason that people relied on many different gods to help them and their state, their city, to survive, in a dangerous world. So you need, your war gods to make sure that you fight off invaders, and you need your farming gods to make sure that you have bountiful harvests, and you need your fishing god, sea gods to make sure that you have good passage over the sea and good fishing and things like that. So you worship all of them, or as many of them as you can. So I just wanted to mention that. But anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I hope that I've just given people some food for thought about the variety of things you can do with religion in a fantasy world and a fantasy role-playing game. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it, and please, share it with other people. If you have comments, please leave them below. I ask that people be polite, but polite does not mean dishonest. I welcome your honesty. I honestly want to know what you really think. But, all I mean by polite is just you don't need to be a jerk about saying what you think. You just say what you think. And if you enjoy this video series, please consider subscribing. And thank you very much for watching. Happy gaming.